Jefferson County Criminal Court falls into stunned silence as U.S. Attorney General Marcus Mitchell enters with federal marshals and Supreme Court emergency stay orders, his cabinet-level authority unmistakable, while evidence of Judge Lawrence Hamilton's systematically biased death penalty sentencing is presented to shocked observers. Judge Hamilton's confident judicial authority crumbles as he recognizes the 18-year-old defendant he'd just sentenced to death row, the same young man he'd dismissed as another violent criminal who deserves ultimate punishment to satisfy justice. "Good afternoon, Judge Hamilton," Attorney General Mitchell announces, his voice carrying the full weight of the nation's highest law enforcement authority throughout the packed courtroom. "I am Attorney General Marcus Mitchell, United States Department of Justice. Some of you may recognize my son Andre, the 18-year-old recent high school graduate you just sentenced to death based on a wrongful conviction built on prosecutorial misconduct and suppressed evidence." His eyes lock onto Hamilton, who has gone pale. "Judge Hamilton, I believe we need to discuss why you imposed a death sentence on an innocent teenager and why you stated in your ruling that defendants of this nature require the ultimate sanction to protect civilized society." The gathered courtroom freezes in recognition. The judge, who moments ago wielded absolute power over life and death, now faces the Attorney General, whose son he condemned to execution, and federal intervention has already begun. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 96 hours earlier, Attorney General Marcus Mitchell had been briefing the President on federal law enforcement priorities when his 18-year-old son Andre was arrested in Jefferson County on murder charges that would escalate into capital prosecution, demonstrating the catastrophic intersection of wrongful conviction and death penalty bias. At 52, Marcus had dedicated his 30-year legal career to criminal justice reform and wrongful conviction prevention, his appointment as second black attorney general representing both personal achievement and national commitment to equal justice that his professional advocacy exemplified. His journey from Jefferson County public defender to federal prosecutor to the nation's highest law enforcement position had been shaped by witnessing systematic injustices destroying innocent lives, particularly young black men who faced presumption of guilt rather than innocence when accused of serious crimes. Andre Mitchell, at 18, represented the achievement that education and opportunity could provide. Recent high school graduate with 3.8 GPA, accepted to Howard University on academic scholarship, youth mentorship volunteer, and respectful young man whose character earned admiration from teachers, employers, and community leaders. His mother, Dr. Simone Mitchell, a trauma surgeon at Jefferson Medical Center, had instilled the same dedication and discipline that characterized her medical career, their two-parent professional household providing stability and resources that systematic inequality denied to many families in their community. "Dad prosecutes criminals and Mom saves lives," Andre would explain to younger students he mentored. "They taught me that success requires integrity, hard work, and commitment to serving others rather than just personal advancement." The 18-year-old's pride in his parents was matched by their fierce love and determination that Andre would have every opportunity their success could provide. His Howard Scholarship representing culmination of family sacrifice and Andre's academic dedication. Judge Lawrence Hamilton had been serving on Jefferson County Criminal Court for 22 years, his judicial tenure characterized by aggressive use of death penalty, particularly in cases involving black defendants accused of crimes against white victims. At 63, Hamilton's judicial philosophy reflected law and order ideology that manifested as racial bias in capital sentencing. His willingness to impose death penalty earned him reputation as toughest judge in the state among prosecutors who sought maximum punishment. Statistical analysis documented that Hamilton sentenced black defendants to death at rates 520% higher than white defendants convicted of comparable murders, his pattern of discriminatory capital sentencing representing exactly the systematic racism that Supreme Court precedents prohibited but inadequate oversight failed to prevent. Judicial review systems had examined complaints about Hamilton's death penalty bias without implementing meaningful correction, the life tenure and independence protecting judges enabling systematic constitutional violations affecting dozens of capital defendants whose cases hadn't attracted adequate scrutiny. District Attorney Charles Donovan had built his political career on aggressive prosecution and high conviction rates. His approach to capital cases prioritizing death sentences that satisfied public demand for harsh punishment, while his methods sometimes sacrificed accuracy for expediency. The institutional culture in Jefferson County valued convictions over justice, prosecutors receiving promotions based on conviction rates and severity of sentences rather than accuracy of outcomes or constitutional compliance in evidence gathering and presentation. Andre's arrest had occurred following a robbery murder at convenience store, where he had been regular customer, the victim a white college student working night shift whose death had generated intense media coverage and community demand for swift justice. Surveillance footage showed the killer's build and general appearance, but face was obscured by hood and mask. Physical evidence was minimal, and investigation had initially produced no leads despite intense pressure from victim's family and media attention demanding arrest. 3 weeks after the murder, anonymous tip had directed police to Andre, based on claim that he had been seen near the store that evening and had recently acquired unexplained money, the circumstantial accusation triggering arrest despite complete absence of physical evidence connecting him to the crime. Andre's actual whereabouts during the murder had been documented. He was at youth center tutoring session with multiple witnesses, including supervising teacher and 6 students he had been helping with homework during the relevant time frame. But Donovan's charging decision had been strategic rather than evidence-based, pursuing capital murder charges despite alibi witnesses, lack of physical evidence, and circumstantial nature of case that should have warranted thorough investigation rather than aggressive prosecution. The death penalty threat had been designed to coerce confession or plea bargain, the risk of execution typically forcing even innocent defendants to accept life imprisonment rather than face trial, where systematic bias made conviction possible despite inadequate evidence. What neither Donovan nor Hamilton could have anticipated was that this routine capital case involving young black defendant would involve the son of the nation's Attorney General, whose authority would ensure unprecedented federal scrutiny of every aspect of prosecution and sentencing. Marcus had been unaware of Andre's arrest for crucial 72 hours due to systematic failures. Andre's phone call had been to his mother rather than father to avoid worrying him during important federal meetings. Simone's trauma surgery schedule had delayed her ability to hire adequate counsel, and capital defense attorneys' overwhelming caseload had prevented immediate family coordination about defendants' prominent parentage. By the time Marcus learned of Andre's arrest, trial had been scheduled under expedited capital prosecution procedures that denied adequate preparation time. Prosecution had suppressed exculpatory evidence, including surveillance footage from nearby, camera showing different suspect, and jury selection had systematically excluded potential black jurors through pretextual challenges. As Andre's capital trial proceeded with shocking speed through system designed to process rather than protect defendants facing death penalty, Marcus was racing from Washington to Jefferson, understanding that his son faced execution for murder. He didn't commit through systematic failures that his career had been dedicated to preventing. The Attorney General, who had advocated for death penalty reform and wrongful conviction prevention, was about to experience personally the devastating impact of capital punishment's intersection with systematic racism and prosecutorial misconduct that he had fought professionally to eliminate. Andre Mitchell stood before Judge Lawrence Hamilton during capital sentencing hearing, his 18-year-old composure barely containing the terror of facing execution for murder he hadn't committed based on evidence the prosecution knew was insufficient but had presented anyway to secure conviction and death sentence. The trial had been systematic miscarriage of justice, inadequate capital defense representation, overwhelmed by caseload, prosecution's suppression of exculpatory evidence, including alibi corroborating surveillance footage, witness testimony, coerced through plea deals, jury selection that excluded black voices, and Hamilton's rulings consistently favoring prosecution while denying defense motions that might have revealed the wrongful conviction. Mr. Mitchell, you have been convicted by jury of capital murder during commission of armed robbery, Hamilton announced with tone suggesting satisfaction rather than the gravity that death sentencing should require. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Andre's attorney Malik Stevens attempted final advocacy despite systematic obstacles. Your Honor, Andre Mitchell is 18-year-old recent high school graduate with no criminal record, accepted to Howard University on academic scholarship, and strong alibi testimony from multiple witnesses placing him at youth center during the murder. Stevens presented evidence documenting Andre's character, academic achievements, youth mentorship work, teacher recommendations, employer testimony about his reliability and integrity, and community support letters from people who knew his peaceful nature. The evidence presented at trial was entirely circumstantial. Stevens continued with desperation evident in his voice. No physical evidence connects Andre to this crime. No DNA, no fingerprints, no murder weapon, no stolen property. The anonymous tip that led to his arrest has never been verified, and prosecution suppressed surveillance footage that could have exonerated him. His legal argument emphasized reasonable doubt that should have prevented conviction. But Hamilton's predetermined approach to capital sentencing treated defense advocacy as irrelevant formality. Counsel, the jury has rendered its verdict after reviewing evidence and testimony, Hamilton responded dismissively. Mr. Mitchell's academic achievements don't override the serious criminal conduct that resulted in innocent victims' death. The characterization of Andre as guilty despite overwhelming reasonable doubt revealed exactly the systematic bias that treated black defendants as presumptively guilty, regardless of evidence. Quality Dr. Simone Mitchell, Andre's mother, provided tearful family testimony. Your Honor, my son is innocent. He was at youth center helping students with homework when this murder occurred. We have witnesses who saw him there, but prosecution dismissed their testimony and suppressed video evidence that would prove Andre couldn't have committed this, her crime, her maternal anguish and professional credibility as respected surgeon should have prompted judicial reconsideration of case with such obvious evidentiary problems. But Hamilton's response revealed complete disregard for justice over finality. Ma'am, the appeals process exists to review verdicts and evidence, Hamilton stated with bureaucratic coldness. This court's responsibility is implementing jury's decision based on evidence presented during trial. Teacher Gloria Anderson provided character testimony. Your Honor, I've known Andre since he was in middle school. He's an exceptional young man who volunteers his time helping younger students. His arrest shocked everyone who knows him because violence is completely inconsistent with his character and values. Multiple educators, employers, and community leaders had testified about Andre's exemplary character and peaceful nature, contradicting prosecution's portrayal of him as violent criminal. But Hamilton dismissed their testimony as misguided sympathy rather than evidence of innocence. Youth pastor Timothy Brooks testified about Andre's whereabouts. "Your Honor, Andre was at our youth center from 6 to 9:30 p.m. on the night of the murder, which occurred at 7:45 p.m., according to police timeline. I supervised the tutoring session where 6 students and 2 other volunteers saw Andre continuously present. He couldn't have committed this crime. The alibi testimony should have created reasonable doubt, preventing conviction. But prosecution had convinced jury that witnesses were mistaken or lying to protect defendant, while suppressed surveillance footage that would have corroborated the alibi was never shown to jury. Andre finally spoke in his own defense. "Your Honor, I didn't kill anyone. I was helping kids with their homework when this murder happened. I've never been violent, never been in trouble, and I was looking forward to starting college in the fall. Please don't execute me for something I didn't do. Please investigate the real killer instead of ending my life for a crime I'm innocent of." His articulate plea demonstrated intelligence and humanity that death sentence would destroy. But Hamilton's predetermined conclusions made personal appeal futile against systematic bias and prosecutorial misconduct. "Mr. Mitchell, this court has heard your statement and the jury's verdict," Hamilton responded without evident empathy. "However, the serious nature of this crime and the need to provide justice for the victim and her family require the ultimate sanction that our law permits." Hamilton announced sentence with shocking finality. "Andre Mitchell, you are hereby sentenced to death by lethal injection. This sentence reflects the heinous nature of capital murder, society's need for ultimate accountability, and this court's assessment that your crime warrants the maximum punishment available under law." The courtroom erupted. Dr. Mitchell's screams of anguish. Family supporters' protests at the unjust sentence. Stevens's objection about wrongful conviction and constitutional violations. And Andre's visible collapse as reality of death row destroyed his future and potentially his life. "Your Honor, this is wrongful conviction." Stevens protested desperately. "Death sentence for innocent teenager based on suppressed evidence and circumstantial case violates every constitutional protection and represents judicial murder rather than justice." Hamilton gavelled for order. Counsel's objection is noted for record. This court has imposed lawful sentence based on jury verdict. Defendant is remanded to death row immediately pending automatic appeals process. As guards approached to take Andre into custody for transport to death row, his permitted phone call would trigger federal response that Hamilton couldn't have anticipated. The teenager he'd sentenced to execution was about to call his father, whose authority as Attorney General would transform wrongful capital conviction into unprecedented federal intervention, the immediate aftermath of Judge Hamilton's death sentence on Andre Mitchell escalated from wrongful conviction into constitutional crisis as the 18-year-old's permitted phone call revealed family connection that would transform routine capital case into unprecedented federal prosecution of judicial and prosecutorial misconduct. Andre was escorted to death row, holding area where condemned prisoners awaited transport, to maximum security execution facility, his hands shaking as he dialed the number he'd avoided using during arrest and trial to prevent distracting his father from critical federal responsibilities. "Dad," Andre whispered when Marcus answered, his voice breaking with terror that no 18-year-old should have to articulate. "The judge sentenced me to death. I'm going to death row for murder I didn't commit. Dad, they're going to execute me. I'm so scared. I don't want to die." Attorney General Marcus Mitchell felt his world collapse as paternal instinct overwhelmed professional composure. "Andre, what? Death sentence? Son, tell me exactly what happened. Who is the judge? Who prosecuted? And what evidence did they present?" His rapid-fire questions reflected both father's panic and prosecutor's immediate assessment that systematic failures had produced catastrophic injustice. Judge Lawrence Hamilton sentenced me, Andre explained through tears that guards coldly ignored. Dad Charles Donovan prosecuted. Dad, I was at youth center during the murder. Pastor Brooks and 6 students saw me there the whole time. But prosecution said witnesses were lying, and they never showed jury the security camera. Footage that would prove I was there. Marcus's legal mind immediately recognized not just wrongful conviction, but prosecutorial misconduct through evidence. Suppression Brady violations that invalidated conviction, regardless of jury verdict. Andre, listen carefully, Marcus stated with forced calm, while signaling his chief of staff to mobilize emergency federal response. You are not going to be executed. What happened to you is exactly the injustice I've spent my career fighting. I'm bringing full federal authority to Jefferson County immediately. Stay strong, son. Your dad is coming to fix this. As Andre was led toward death row transport, Marcus was already coordinating unprecedented federal intervention that would descend on Jefferson County within hours and expose systematic capital punishment failures, affecting far more than just attorney generals. Family. Back in courtroom, Judge Hamilton was concluding administrative matters when Attorney Stevens made desperate disclosure. Your Honor, I need to inform you that Andre Mitchell's father is Marcus Mitchell, United States Attorney General. This death sentence will face unprecedented federal scrutiny that will reveal the prosecutorial misconduct and wrongful conviction that occurred in this case. Hamilton's reaction revealed defensive arrogance rather than appropriate concern. Counsel, I'm aware of defendant's family connections. However, this court's decisions are based on evidence and law, not political considerations. The death sentence imposed is appropriate, regardless of family status or federal position. His dismissal of federal authority demonstrated exactly the judicial arrogance that had enabled years of discriminatory capital sentencing without adequate accountability or oversight. District Attorney Donovan, overhearing the revelation, suddenly recognized catastrophic problem. Judge Hamilton, if the defendant is Attorney General's son, this case will face comprehensive federal review. We should immediately disclose all evidence in our files and consider whether grounds exist for reconsideration given the unique circumstances. His suggestion revealed awareness that suppressed exculpatory evidence would face federal investigation, that routine capital cases avoided through inadequate appellate resources and overwhelming systemic pressures. D.A. Donovan, this court doesn't modify lawful sentences based on political pressure or family connections, Hamilton responded stubbornly. The Attorney General's position doesn't entitle his son to preferential treatment or special consideration that other capital defendants wouldn't receive. His principled-sounding justification ignored that other capital defendants routinely faced wrongful convictions and procedural violations that inadequate oversight failed to prevent. Not that Andre deserved preferential treatment, but that all defendants deserved constitutional protection he'd been systematically denied. Dr. Simone Mitchell confronted both judge and prosecutor with surgical precision. You sentenced my son to death knowing he's innocent. You suppressed evidence that would have prevented conviction, dismissed alibi witnesses, and rushed this case to execution because you wanted conviction more than justice. But you just condemned Attorney General's son based on lies, and his father has authority to ensure you face consequences. Her prediction would prove accurate, as federal machinery was already mobilizing with resources and authority that typical wrongful conviction cases never accessed, despite equal innocence and constitutional violations. Reverend Solomon Mitchell, Andre's grandfather and prominent civil rights leader, provided moral authority. Judge Hamilton, you've sentenced innocent young man to death to satisfy political demands for harsh punishment, but this time you've condemned grandson of someone who marched with Dr. King and son of someone who can bring federal power against systematic injustice you represent. Community supporters began immediate mobilization. Youth Pastor Brooks coordinated alibi witness affidavits. Teacher Anderson organized character. Testimony and social media documentation of wrongful conviction began spreading. 18-year-old honor student sentenced to death despite solid alibi and no physical evidence, viral posts declared. Judge Lawrence Hamilton condemned Attorney General's innocent son to execution. Federal intervention is imminent. The social media amplification created public accountability pressure while documenting obvious injustice for federal investigation already underway. Meanwhile, Department of Justice leadership was implementing emergency protocols unprecedented in scope. Deputy AG Elizabeth Warren coordinated immediate federal intervention. Solicitor General Theodore Grant prepared emergency Supreme Court stay, and U.S. Marshals were dispatched to prevent Andre's transfer to death row pending federal review. Attorney General Mitchell's son has been wrongfully convicted and sentenced to death based on prosecutorial misconduct and suppressed evidence. Warren briefed senior DOJ officials during emergency session. We're implementing immediate federal intervention, addressing both individual injustice and systematic capital punishment failures that this case exposes. Federal response was mobilizing resources that typical death row inmates couldn't access, but comprehensive intervention would address systematic problems affecting dozens of capital cases, rather than merely securing privileged justice for one powerful family. As Hamilton left courthouse confident in judicial independence and Donovan panicked about federal scrutiny of suppressed evidence, neither yet fully grasped that sentencing Attorney General's innocent son to death had triggered federal reckoning, exposing systematic capital punishment, racism, and misconduct, requiring unprecedented accountability. While Judge Hamilton completed administrative matters following Andre Mitchell's death sentencing, unprecedented federal mobilization was creating comprehensive institutional response that would transform what Hamilton considered lawful capital punishment into the largest federal investigation of death penalty misconduct and wrongful conviction in Department of Justice history. Attorney General Marcus Mitchell's emergency directive triggered immediate activation of every federal resource available. My son has been sentenced to death based on wrongful conviction built on prosecutorial misconduct and suppressed exculpatory evidence. This case represents systematic capital punishment failures requiring immediate federal intervention and comprehensive accountability. His personal experience with the ultimate injustice that his career had been dedicated to preventing created unique situation where highest federal law enforcement authority would be applied to death penalty case that exemplified every systemic failure he had professionally fought to address. Deputy Attorney General Elizabeth Warren coordinated comprehensive federal response involving multiple agencies. Civil Rights Division investigating systematic discrimination in Hamilton's death sentencing patterns, Criminal Division reviewing prosecutorial misconduct, Capital Crimes Unit examining suppressed evidence, and Federal Public Defender coordinating emergency appellate intervention. Attorney General Mitchell's son experienced catastrophic wrongful conviction that capital punishment system is designed to prevent but systematically enables. Warren briefed emergency coordination meeting. Federal response must address institutional failures affecting dozens of capital cases, not merely secure, privileged intervention for cabinet family. The federal approach ensured Andre's case would catalyze death penalty reform rather than representing exceptional intervention available only to powerful families whose resources could challenge systematic injustices. FBI Evidence Response Team had been dispatched to Jefferson County to secure all physical evidence, surveillance footage, and case files before local authorities could destroy materials. Preservation of evidence is critical. Reports suggest prosecution suppressed exculpatory surveillance footage and alibi corroborating materials that would have prevented wrongful conviction. Federal evidence seizure would ensure that prosecutorial misconduct couldn't be concealed, through destruction of materials that proved innocence and constitutional violations. Solicitor General Theodore Grant was preparing emergency Supreme Court petition. Andre Mitchell faces execution based on conviction that violated Brady requirements through evidence suppression, denied Sixth Amendment rights through inadequate counsel, and reflects systematic racial bias in capital sentencing requiring immediate stay and comprehensive review. The emergency Supreme Court intervention would provide immediate relief, while broader investigation addressed institutional problems enabling wrongful capital convictions. Federal judicial monitoring systems had independently identified Hamilton's death sentencing patterns through routine oversight. Judge Hamilton sentences black defendants to death at rates 520% higher than white defendants in comparable cases. Statistical analysis demonstrates systematic racial discrimination in capital punishment, requiring federal prosecution. The independent federal data validated that Andre's death sentence represented pattern rather than isolated error, requiring individual rather than systematic response. Meanwhile, Innocence Project had been contacted by community members and was mobilizing comprehensive wrongful conviction investigation. Andre Mitchell's case shows classic hallmarks of wrongful capital conviction: circumstantial evidence suppressed, exculpatory materials, coerced witness testimony, inadequate defense representation, and rush to judgment. National advocacy networks were preparing systematic response that would complement federal institutional action while ensuring that wrongful conviction reform extended beyond individual case to address structural problems. Congressional Black Caucus received emergency briefing. Attorney General Mitchell's son sentenced to death despite alibi testimony and suppressed exculpatory evidence. Case demonstrates systematic capital punishment failures requiring legislative oversight and reform. Legislative attention ensured political accountability would complement prosecutorial response to systematic death penalty injustices. Supreme Court clerks were reviewing emergency stay petition with unusual urgency. Capital defendant is Attorney General's son facing execution based on apparent wrongful conviction. Political sensitivity and constitutional violations warrant immediate judicial intervention. The court's attention to case ensured highest judicial scrutiny of death penalty procedures that routine capital cases rarely received despite equal constitutional violations. Legal scholars were analyzing constitutional implications. Mitchell case demonstrates systematic failures in capital punishment, prosecutorial misconduct through evidence suppression, inadequate defense representation, racial bias in jury selection, and sentencing and judicial tolerance of constitutional violations. Academic analysis provided expert validation that Andre's death sentence violated multiple established constitutional protections, requiring immediate federal intervention. Media coverage was exploding from local to international attention. U.S. Attorney General's son sentenced to death sparks crisis over wrongful convictions, prosecutorial misconduct, and racial bias in capital punishment system. The unprecedented publicity ensured attempted administrative dismissal or quiet resolution would face global scrutiny demanding comprehensive accountability. Social media was creating grassroots pressure. If Attorney General's son can be wrongfully convicted and sentenced to death, what happens to defendants whose families lack resources to fight systematic injustice? Public consciousness about privilege Differential was elevating case to examination of death penalty's systematic racism and unreliability, affecting defendants without powerful advocates. Death row authorities received emergency federal directive. Andre Mitchell is not to be processed into general death row population pending federal review. Special protective custody under federal supervision required due to ongoing investigation. The protection ensured Andre's safety while preventing psychological trauma of death row placement during emergency federal intervention. Anti-death penalty organizations were coordinating response. Mitchell case represents everything wrong, with capital punishment, racial bias, prosecutorial misconduct, wrongful conviction, and systemic rush to execution despite obvious doubts about guilt. Advocacy would ensure Andre's case addressed death penalty's systematic failures rather than remaining isolated incident of individual injustice. White House was briefed on developing crisis. Attorney General Mitchell's son facing execution for apparent wrongful conviction. Constitutional implications and political sensitivity require careful federal response balancing legal intervention with separation of powers concerns. Presidential awareness ensured highest levels of government would monitor situation requiring both legal precision and political sensitivity given unprecedented nature of cabinet members' family facing state execution. As multiple accountability systems converged on Jefferson County, Judge Hamilton remained unaware that his routine exercise of capital sentencing authority had triggered unprecedented federal response that would expose death penalty's systematic racism while demonstrating how privilege enabled justice that should have been universal right rather than exceptional intervention. Attorney General Marcus Mitchell arrived in Jefferson County 18 hours after Andre's death, sentencing with federal authority and paternal determination that transformed what Judge Hamilton considered final capital judgment into immediate federal intervention requiring comprehensive accountability for wrongful conviction and systematic death penalty failures. The Attorney General's arrival with federal marshals, FBI evidence teams, and senior DOJ officials created immediate institutional crisis as local authorities recognized that routine capital case had attracted unprecedented federal scrutiny at cabinet level. "I am Attorney General Marcus Mitchell," he announced to assembled courthouse personnel with controlled fury, barely masking paternal anguish. "Yesterday, Judge Lawrence Hamilton sentenced my 18-year-old son to death based on wrongful conviction, built on prosecutorial misconduct and suppressed exculpatory evidence. Department of Justice will address this miscarriage of justice with full federal authority." His statement combined personal advocacy with institutional power, making clear that father's determination to save his son would be backed by comprehensive federal law enforcement resources and prosecutorial authority. Judge Hamilton was summoned to emergency federal meeting where he faced Attorney General directly, his judicial confidence wavering as he recognized that death sentence he'd considered appropriate exercise of discretion had attracted the nation's highest law enforcement attention. "Judge Hamilton," Marcus stated with prosecutorial precision honed over 3 decades, "you sentenced my son to death despite alibi testimony from multiple witnesses, suppressed surveillance footage proving his innocence, and no physical evidence connecting him to this crime. Your capital sentencing history shows systematic racial bias, sentencing black defendants to death at rates exceeding 500% compared to white defendants in identical cases." His citation of both individual injustice and systematic pattern demonstrated federal response would address institutional racism rather than requesting privileged intervention for his son alone. Hamilton attempted defensive justification. "Attorney General Mitchell, I understand your paternal concern, but judicial decisions are based on jury verdicts and evidence presented during trial. Your son was convicted through established legal procedures that appellate review exists to examine. His response revealed expectation that judicial independence would protect him from accountability, despite obvious constitutional violations and wrongful conviction. Judge Hamilton, jury verdict based on suppressed evidence, doesn't justify death. Sentence for innocent teenager, Marcus responded with devastating legal precision. Federal investigation reveals prosecutorial Brady violations, inadequate defense representation, and your systematic pattern of racially discriminatory capital sentencing, constituting civil rights violations requiring federal prosecution. The legal framework made clear that federal intervention would pursue criminal charges against both judge and prosecutor, rather than merely correcting individual sentencing error. Deputy A.G. Warren presented comprehensive federal evidence. Judge Hamilton D.A. Donovan, Department of Justice, has secured surveillance footage that prosecution suppressed showing Andre Mitchell at youth center during murder. 6 alibi witnesses corroborate his presence. Physical evidence that anonymous tip claimed existed was fabricated. This death sentence represents wrongful conviction requiring immediate federal intervention. The institutional evidence of innocence and prosecutorial misconduct eliminated any possibility that appeals process would be adequate remedy given imminent execution timeline and systematic failures. Federal emergency stay was granted by Supreme Court within hours. Capital defendant Andre Mitchell's execution is stayed pending comprehensive federal review of constitutional violations, including prosecutorial misconduct through evidence suppression and systematic racial bias in sentencing. The Supreme Court intervention provided immediate relief while signaling highest judicial concern about death penalty procedures in this case. District Attorney Donovan attempted damage control. Attorney General Mitchell, upon federal review of evidence, I recognize serious concerns about this prosecution. Perhaps we can discuss appropriate resolution addressing justice while acknowledging the unique circumstances. His conciliatory approach revealed recognition that suppressed evidence and federal scrutiny threatened not only individual case, but his entire prosecutorial career and potential criminal liability. Marcus's response was uncompromising. D.A. Donovan, you suppressed evidence proving my son's innocence to secure wrongful death sentence. Federal prosecution will examine whether your misconduct constitutes criminal civil rights violations. Justice isn't negotiable, and my son's innocence isn't unique circumstance. It's constitutional violation affecting every wrongfully convicted defendant you've prosecuted. The expansion of accountability to systematic prosecutorial practices demonstrated federal intervention would address entire capital punishment pipeline producing wrongful convictions and discriminatory outcomes. Federal forensic review of suppressed evidence was completed. Surveillance footage clearly shows Andre Mitchell at youth center from 6:15 to 9:45 p.m. Murder occurred at 7:45 p.m. 2 miles away. Physical timeline makes Andre's involvement impossible. Prosecution knowingly suppressed exculpatory evidence that would have prevented conviction. The scientific evidence of innocence combined with proof of intentional prosecutorial misconduct created overwhelming federal case for both Andre's exoneration and criminal prosecution of officials responsible. U.S. Marshals took Andre into protective federal custody from death row. Federal jurisdiction pending constitutional review. Andre Mitchell remains under federal protection until wrongful conviction is addressed. The custody transfer demonstrated federal authority superseding state death penalty system while ensuring Andre's safety and preventing psychological trauma of death row imprisonment during exoneration process. Marcus visited Andre in federal facility. Their reunion emotional as father and attorney general roles merged. Andre, I promised you won't be executed for crime you didn't commit. Federal government is not only exonerating you but prosecuting everyone responsible for this injustice while addressing systematic death penalty failures that nearly killed you. His dual commitment to personal justice and institutional reform demonstrated how individual case would catalyze comprehensive transformation. Media coverage intensified as Attorney General's personal involvement became global story. Nations. Chief law enforcement officer demands accountability after son wrongfully sentenced to death. Federal investigation exposes systematic failures in capital punishment system. The unprecedented publicity created accountability pressure that administrative protection historically prevented, while elevating death penalty reform to international human rights priority. As federal intervention mobilized resources addressing Andre's immediate exoneration and systematic capital punishment failures, Hamilton and Donovan recognized that their actions had triggered unprecedented federal accountability that judicial independence and prosecutorial discretion couldn't prevent when wrongful death sentence attracted comprehensive constitutional scrutiny. Jefferson County judicial system became epicenter of federal intervention as Attorney General Mitchell's unprecedented use of cabinet authority combined with overwhelming evidence of Andre's innocence to expose death penalty's systematic failures, requiring immediate prosecution of judicial and prosecutorial misconduct. Within 72 hours of federal intervention, comprehensive evidence review proved Andre's complete innocence. Surveillance footage prosecution suppressed shows Andre Mitchell at youth center during entire time frame when murder occurred. Forensic timeline analysis confirms physical impossibility of his involvement. Anonymous tip that triggered arrest was fabricated by actual perpetrator attempting to divert investigation. The exculpatory evidence was so overwhelming that states was forced to dismiss all charges. Commonwealth moves to dismiss capital murder charges against Andre Mitchell based on newly discovered evidence proving actual innocence. Defendant is completely exonerated and entitled to immediate release. Andre walked free after 5 months of wrongful imprisonment, including weeks on death row. His reunion with family captured by media, creating powerful imagery of father-son. Embrace. Attorney General's son, exonerated after federal intervention, exposes wrongful capital conviction and prosecutorial misconduct. The personal story humanized death penalty's capacity for irreversible injustice, while demonstrating real-world consequences of systematic failures and importance of federal accountability. Department of Justice announced unprecedented federal criminal charges. District Attorney Charles Donovan faces federal prosecution for conspiracy to violate civil rights, prosecutorial misconduct, obstruction of justice, and deprivation of rights under color of law. Evidence demonstrates intentional suppression of exculpatory materials and fabrication of evidence to secure wrongful death sentence. The prosecutorial accountability established precedent that DA misconduct in capital cases carried serious federal criminal consequences beyond professional discipline or disbarment. Judge Hamilton faced federal investigation for systematic death penalty bias. Lawrence Hamilton sentenced over 140 defendants to death during 22-year tenure, with black defendants receiving death sentences at rates 520% higher than white defendants in comparable cases. Statistical analysis demonstrates intentional racial discrimination requiring federal civil rights prosecution. The comprehensive evidence transformed individual case into prosecution of systematic judicial racism in capital sentencing requiring criminal accountability. Attorney General Mitchell addressed nation during press conference, explaining both personal trauma and systematic implications. My son Andre spent weeks on death row for murder he didn't commit. Federal resources enabled swift exoneration, but That reality exposes privilege. Dozens of innocent people remain on death row without access to justice that my position provided my son. His framing emphasized that Andre's exoneration must catalyze systematic reform rather than representing privileged exception that validated death penalty for defendants without powerful advocates. Andre's innocence doesn't represent rare anomaly, Marcus continued. Research suggests significant percentage of death row inmates are innocent, but lack resources for adequate appellate representation. Federal government must address death penalty's systematic unreliability and racial bias. The policy critique connected individual case to broader constitutional problems requiring comprehensive death penalty reform or abolition. Congressional hearings examined how Attorney General's son could be wrongfully convicted and sentenced to death. Systematic failures allowed constitutional violations and prosecutorial misconduct to proceed to death sentencing without triggering adequate oversight. This represents institutional crisis requiring legislative response. Legislative scrutiny addressed structural problems that privilege had temporarily overcome while demanding systematic solutions, preventing similar wrongful capital convictions. Supreme Court announced review of death penalty procedures. Mitchell case exposes systematic problems in capital punishment requiring constitutional examination. Court will review whether contemporary death penalty administration violates Eighth Amendment protections against arbitrary and racially discriminatory punishment. Judicial attention at highest level signaled potential transformative death penalty jurisprudence emerging from Andre's wrongful conviction. District Attorney Donovan was arrested on federal charges. His perp walk broadcast nationally. Former prosecutor who suppressed evidence to secure wrongful death sentence now faces federal prosecution and potential imprisonment. The public accountability demonstrated that prosecutorial misconduct carried serious consequences when federal resources were applied to cases typically lacking adequate appellate review. Actual perpetrator was identified through federal investigation and arrested. DNA evidence and confession proved that Derek Wilson committed convenience store murder for which Andre Mitchell was wrongfully convicted and sentenced to death. Wilson fabricated anonymous tip to divert investigation while innocent teenager faced execution. The identification of actual killer validated Andre's innocence while demonstrating how wrongful convictions allowed dangerous criminals to remain free, endangering public safety. Civil rights organizations filed comprehensive lawsuit. Mitchell case represents systematic death penalty failures affecting thousands of capital defendants. Class action seeks relief for all death row inmates sentenced through constitutional violations, racial bias, and inadequate representation. Collective legal action ensured federal intervention would benefit broader population beyond Attorney General's family. Judge Hamilton resigned under federal investigation. Hamilton's systematic racial bias in capital sentencing requires comprehensive review of all 140 death sentences he imposed. Affected defendants entitled to resentencing hearings. The institutional accountability addressed systematic pattern affecting dozens of capital cases beyond Andre's individual wrongful conviction. As comprehensive federal prosecution proceeded, and Andre's complete exoneration was documented, the power shift was complete. The judge and prosecutor who had confidently sentenced innocent teenager to death now faced federal criminal charges while their systematic failures were being examined for dozens of other wrongful capital convictions. Most importantly, Andre's experience had exposed death penalty's systematic racism and unreliability, while demonstrating that privilege enabled justice that should be universal right rather than exceptional intervention available only to powerful families. The Attorney General whose son had nearly been executed for crime he didn't commit was ensuring maternal and paternal advocacy would catalyze reforms protecting all capital defendants, rather than securing privileged exception that left systematic injustice intact. Within 8 months of Andre Mitchell's exoneration, comprehensive federal prosecution and institutional reform transformed death penalty from locally controlled practice, enabling wrongful convictions into federally monitored system, requiring constitutional compliance and innocence protections benefiting all capital defendants. Department of Justice secured federal conviction of District Attorney Charles Donovan on all charges. Charles Donovan intentionally suppressed exculpatory evidence, fabricated testimony, and violated constitutional rights to secure wrongful death sentence. His prosecutorial misconduct represents criminal civil rights violations, requiring maximum federal accountability. Federal jury deliberated 90 minutes before returning guilty verdicts, the evidence of intentional evidence suppression and knowing prosecution of innocent defendant, creating overwhelming proof of criminal misconduct. Federal Judge Robert Lawrence imposed 18-year prison sentence during emotional proceedings. Charles Donovan, you abused prosecutorial authority to send innocent teenager to death row. Your misconduct nearly resulted in state execution of Attorney General's son and represents systematic violation of constitutional rights, affecting your entire prosecutorial tenure. Substantial federal sentence acknowledges devastating harm you caused. The significant federal sentence established precedent that prosecutorial misconduct in capital cases carried serious criminal consequences beyond professional discipline. Comprehensive case review examined all 340 convictions Donovan had secured during his tenure. Federal review identifies 67 cases where Donovan suppressed exculpatory evidence, coerced witness testimony, or engaged in other constitutional violations. Affected defendants entitled to new trials with adequate representation. The massive review process revealed scope of prosecutorial misconduct extending far beyond Andre's case to affect dozens of wrongfully convicted defendants. Judge Hamilton faced federal civil rights prosecution. Lawrence Hamilton's systematic racial bias in capital sentencing affected 140 death penalty cases over 22 years. Statistical evidence demonstrates intentional discrimination, requiring federal accountability. Federal charges against sitting judge represented unprecedented accountability for systematic death penalty racism that judicial immunity had historically protected. Civil rights settlement included $12.7 million compensatory damages for Andre plus establishment of comprehensive wrongful conviction review program. Financial compensation addresses Andre's trauma, but systematic legal support ensures justice for wrongfully convicted defendants who lack privilege that enabled Andre's swift exoneration. Attorney General Mitchell donated settlement funds to Innocence Project and death penalty defense organizations. Andre's suffering should benefit others facing wrongful capital convictions. These resources will support defendants who don't have Attorney General as father demanding federal intervention. His commitment to leveraging privilege for systemic benefit demonstrated how individual case could catalyze broader transformation, serving collective rather than individual justice. Jefferson County death penalty prosecutions were suspended indefinitely under federal consent decree. Systematic failures in capital case procedures require comprehensive reform before death penalty can be constitutionally administered. Federal oversight continues until jurisdiction demonstrates sustained compliance. The suspension represented unprecedented federal intervention in state capital punishment authority based on documented systematic constitutional violations. National Death Penalty Accountability Act established federal standards for capital prosecutions, mandatory disclosure of all exculpatory evidence with severe criminal penalties for suppression, independent review of capital convictions before execution, enhanced defense representation funding, and federal prosecution authority when wrongful capital convictions result from official misconduct. Andre Mitchell's wrongful death sentence demonstrated catastrophic failures requiring federal standards preventing states from executing innocent people. Congressional sponsors explained. Attorney General Mitchell established DOJ Capital Case Review Unit with authority to investigate all pending executions. Proactive federal review prevents wrongful executions rather than merely correcting them after innocent people are killed by state. Every capital defendant deserves scrutiny that my position provided. Andre, the institutional innovation ensured sustained federal attention to death penalty cases that had historically proceeded to execution without adequate constitutional review. Andre resumed his life and enrolled at Howard University while becoming powerful advocate against death penalty. I was innocent and still nearly executed because of prosecutorial lies and judicial racism. If system can sentence Attorney General's son to death based on fabricated evidence, imagine what happens to defendants without resources to fight back. His advocacy emphasized that personal exoneration meant nothing without systematic reforms protecting all capital defendants. From wrongful conviction and execution, Supreme Court issued landmark death penalty ruling, citing Mitchell case. Contemporary administration of capital punishment continues to reflect arbitrary and racially discriminatory application violating Eighth Amendment. Mitchell case demonstrates system's inability to prevent execution of innocent people, particularly black defendants facing bias. Throughout prosecution and sentencing, the constitutional ruling didn't abolish death penalty, but imposed strict new requirements making execution far more difficult and expensive to pursue. Educational programs incorporated Andre's case into law school curriculum. Mitchell vs. Jefferson County demonstrates death penalty's capacity for irreversible injustice and systematic racism. Future prosecutors and judges must understand constitutional obligations preventing wrongful capital convictions. Academic integration ensured legal professionals understood both mechanics and consequences of capital punishment failures. Data analysis 3 years after intervention showed measurable impact. Death sentences nationwide decreased 73% as enhanced scrutiny and defense funding prevented wrongful convictions. Racial disparities in capital sentencing dropped 67% under federal monitoring, and 12 additional innocent defendants were exonerated from death. Through comprehensive case reviews that Mitchell case had inspired, evidence demonstrates that enhanced scrutiny prevents both wrongful convictions and systematic racism in capital punishment. Criminal justice researchers documented actual murderer Derek Wilson received life sentence while expressing remorse. "I'm sorry I let innocent kid nearly die for my crime. System was so ready to blame black teenager that they didn't investigate properly. Andre Mitchell almost paid with his life for my actions." His confession and conviction validated Andre's innocence while demonstrating how rush to judgment enabled actual criminals to evade justice. Dr. Simone Mitchell reflected on family trauma. "Watching my son on death row for crime he didn't commit was every parent's nightmare." Marcus's position enabled justice, but thousands of families experience same terror without resources to fight systematic injustice. Her maternal perspective emphasized collective rather than individual impact of wrongful capital convictions. Grandfather Reverend Mitchell's advocacy for death penalty abolition. Bible teaches, "Thou shalt not kill." Government shouldn't execute people, especially when system is so broken that Attorney General's innocent son nearly died. If death penalty can fail this catastrophically for powerful family, it should fail for nobody. Religious leadership provided moral framework, complementing legal and policy arguments against capital punishment. Teacher Gloria Anderson's continued support. Andre could have been destroyed by wrongful conviction and death row trauma. Instead, he's using his experience to protect others. His resilience and advocacy honor not just his survival, but everyone still fighting wrongful capital. Convictions, educational perspective validated, transformation of trauma into social contribution. Federal funding supported capital defense nationwide. Andre Mitchell had inadequate representation that failed to prevent wrongful conviction. Systematic investment ensures indigent capital defendants receive constitutional protection, resource allocation addressed. Foundational inequality where inadequate representation enabled wrongful convictions to proceed. Unchallenged, restorative justice programs brought Andre into dialogue with wrongfully convicted death row inmates. Sharing experiences helps collective healing while educating public about death penalties. Systematic failures affecting hundreds beyond. Attorney General's family, alternative accountability, addressed both individual trauma and cultural transformation. 4 years after wrongful death sentence, comprehensive accountability had imprisoned prosecutor, investigated judge, exonerated dozens of wrongfully convicted capital defendants, and catalyzed death penalty reforms protecting constitutional rights that systematic failures had violated. The consequences demonstrated that comprehensive response to wrongful capital conviction required criminal prosecution, civil liability, systematic case review, enhanced representation, federal monitoring, legislative reform, and sustained advocacy ensuring death penalties administration met constitutional standards or was abolished as inherently unreliable and discriminatory. Over the following 60 months, the transformation catalyzed by Andre Mitchell's wrongful death sentence evolved from Jefferson County specific reforms into national movement, addressing death penalties, systematic racism, and unreliability that had affected countless defendants while institutional failures prevented adequate protection of constitutional rights. The Andre Mitchell Capital Justice Reform Act established comprehensive federal framework transforming death penalty administration, mandatory independent review of all capital convictions before execution, enhanced funding for capital defense, ensuring adequate representation, prohibition on executing defendants under 21, federal prosecution of officials who suppress exculpatory evidence, and automatic federal review when statistical analysis shows racial bias in capital sentencing. Andre Mitchell nearly died because prosecutorial misconduct and judicial racism enabled wrongful death sentence. Congressional sponsors explained during legislative debate. Federal standards ensure systematic protections preventing states from executing innocent people or imposing death penalty through discriminatory processes. The legislative framework created enforceable federal requirements that state death penalty administration had historically avoided through claims of sovereign authority and federalism. Department of Justice National Innocence Review Commission examined all 2,400+ death row cases nationwide. Comprehensive federal review using DNA technology, enhanced investigation, and statistical analysis identifies wrongful convictions requiring immediate relief. The unprecedented federal intervention addressed systematic problems beyond individual cases, using resources to examine every pending execution for potential innocence or constitutional violations. Prosecutorial accountability became federal priority with new DOJ Brady Compliance Unit. Prosecutors who suppress exculpatory evidence face mandatory federal investigation and prosecution. Constitutional obligation to disclose evidence favorable to defendants is not discretionary. Institutional enforcement addressed cultural problem where prosecutors prioritize convictions over justice, using federal criminal consequences to ensure constitutional compliance. Judicial sentencing review became mandatory with statistical analysis identifying bias. Real-time monitoring of death sentencing patterns identifies judges whose capital punishment decisions reflect racial discrimination requiring federal intervention. Technology. Infrastructure created systematic accountability, preventing judges from imposing discriminatory death sentences without triggering, federal oversight and potential prosecution, enhanced capital defense funding increased tenfold. Adequate representation prevents wrongful convictions. Federal investment ensures indigent capital defendants receive constitutional protection regardless of state funding. Priorities. Resource allocation addressed foundational inequality where inadequate representation had enabled wrongful convictions to proceed. Without adequate investigation or defense, automatic DNA testing became required. In all capital cases, scientific evidence provides objective verification that eyewitness testimony and circumstantial evidence historically lacked. Comprehensive testing prevents executing innocent people. Forensic requirements addressed systematic over-reliance on unreliable evidence forms that had contributed to numerous wrongful capital convictions. Attorney General Mitchell used his remaining cabinet tenure prioritizing death penalty reform. Andre's wrongful conviction taught me that death penalty's systematic failures make it incompatible with constitutional justice. Federal authority must ensure either comprehensive reform or abolition. His institutional leadership elevated capital punishment. Reform to federal priority requiring sustained governmental attention and resources. Racial Justice in Sentencing Act prohibited death penalty when statistical evidence showed discrimination. Death sentences imposed through racially biased systems violate equal protection and Eighth Amendment. Jurisdictions with documented disparities cannot constitutionally execute. Defendants legislative prohibition addressed systematic racism that statistical evidence documented, but judicial review had historically failed to remedy. Community oversight boards with death row families and exonerees provided accountability. Those affected by death penalties failures must have voice in reform, ensuring policies serve justice rather than political or institutional interests. Participatory governance included perspectives that professional legal culture had historically excluded despite their crucial experiential knowledge. International human rights monitoring examined American death penalty practices. Mitchell case demonstrates death penalty's incompatibility with modern human rights standards. International pressure reinforces domestic reform efforts. Global attention elevated capital punishment from domestic criminal justice issue to human rights concern, requiring compliance with international legal standards. Academic research validated systematic problems Andre's case had exposed. Comprehensive studies document that significant percentage of death row inmates are innocent. Racial bias affects capital prosecutions at every stage, and wrongful convictions result from systematic rather than isolated failures. Evidence-based analysis provided foundation for policies, addressing documented problems, rather than relying on assumptions about death penalties, fairness, and accuracy. 5 years after wrongful death sentence, comprehensive data demonstrated measurable transformation. Death sentences decreased 81% nationwide as enhanced scrutiny prevented wrongful convictions. Executions declined 92% as mandatory reviews identified constitutional violations. And 47 additional innocent defendants were exonerated from death row through systematic case reviews. Numbers represent lives saved and justice served, federal monitors reported. But Andre Mitchell's greatest legacy is cultural shift from accepting death penalties failures as inevitable to demanding either comprehensive reform or abolition. Andre's continued advocacy while attending law school. I'm alive because federal resources prove my innocence. But system that could wrongfully sentence Attorney General's son to death is fundamentally broken. Death penalty must be abolished because no procedural reforms can eliminate risk of executing innocent people. His evolution from death penalty survivor to abolition advocate demonstrated how personal experience informed principled opposition to capital punishment regardless of procedural improvements. State-level death penalty abolition accelerated following Mitchell case. 15 states abolished capital punishment, citing systematic failures that Andre Mitchell's case exposed. Federal reforms made death penalty prohibitively expensive and difficult to administer. Constitutionally, legislative action at state level complemented federal reforms while demonstrating growing recognition. The death penalty's costs exceeded any benefits. Restorative justice programs addressed harm to families. Death penalty affects not only defendants, but families who experience trauma from wrongful convictions, decades of appeals, and execution of loved ones. Healing requires acknowledging collective harm. Alternative approaches recognized. The capital punishment created trauma extending far beyond individual defendants to affect entire communities and families. Educational curricula from middle school through law school incorporated death penalty's systematic failures. Students learn about capital punishment's racism, unreliability, and capacity for irreversible injustice. Comprehensive education ensures future generations understand constitutional and moral problems. Cultural transformation through education addressed long-term change, requiring sustained commitment beyond immediate policy reforms. The systematic reforms demonstrated that comprehensive transformation required criminal prosecution, legislative action, federal monitoring, enhanced resources, technological infrastructure, community power, international pressure, and sustained advocacy, ensuring death penalty either met stringent constitutional standards or was abolished as incompatible with justice and human rights. 7 years after Judge Lawrence Hamilton sentenced 18-year-old Andre Mitchell to death, father and son stood together at the National Criminal Justice Summit, representing the personal and institutional transformation that had emerged from wrongful conviction that nearly resulted in execution of innocent teenager Andre, now 25 and federal prosecutor specializing in wrongful conviction review, addressed 4,000 attendees, including judges, prosecutors, defense attorneys, and death penalty survivors. 7 years ago, I was on death row for murder I didn't commit. Prosecutor suppressed evidence proving my innocence. Judge sentenced me through racial bias, and system nearly executed me. I'm alive because my father is Attorney General who could mobilize federal resources that most wrongfully convicted defendants never access. His testimony combined personal trauma with systemic critique acknowledging privilege that enabled his exoneration while demanding universal protections. Attorney General Marcus Mitchell, whose cabinet tenure had been defined by criminal justice reform inspired by his son's wrongful capital conviction, reflected on transformation. Andre's death sentence exposed my powerlessness despite being nation's highest law enforcement official. I couldn't prevent systematic failures that nearly killed my son. Federal intervention enabled exoneration, but justice requires systematic transformation, ensuring every capital defendant receives constitutional protection. His acknowledgement of privilege combined with commitment to universal reform demonstrated how individual tragedy could catalyze comprehensive change when those with power demanded collective rather than individual justice. Statistical evidence showed measurable national impact. Death sentences had decreased 87% as enhanced scrutiny prevented wrongful convictions. Executions had declined 94% as mandatory reviews identified constitutional violations. 73 innocent defendants had been exonerated from death row through systematic case reviews, and racial disparities in capital sentencing had decreased 79% under federal monitoring. Numbers represent lives saved and executions prevented, researchers documented. But Attorney General Mitchell's greatest legacy is establishing that death penalty's systematic failures make it incompatible with constitutional justice, requiring either comprehensive reform or abolition. District Attorney Donovan remained in federal prison serving 18-year sentence, his prosecutorial career ending in disgrace that deterred officials from similar misconduct. Donovan's conviction established that suppressing evidence to secure wrongful death sentences constitutes federal crime carrying serious consequences. His imprisonment represented both individual accountability and symbolic victory, demonstrating prosecutorial misconduct faced criminal prosecution, rather than merely professional discipline. Judge Hamilton had resigned under federal investigation and faced ongoing civil litigation. Hamilton's systematic racial bias in capital sentencing affected 140 death penalty cases. Comprehensive review resulted in 37 death sentences being overturned due to discriminatory practices. The judicial accountability addressed systematic pattern, affecting dozens of capital defendants beyond Andre's. Individual wrongful conviction, 12 states had abolished death penalty, citing Mitchell case as catalyst. Wrongful capital conviction of Attorney General's son demonstrated death penalty's fundamental unreliability. If system can nearly execute innocent teenager from powerful family, it cannot be trusted with anyone's life. Legislative abolition at state level demonstrated growing recognition that capital punishment's risks exceeded any societal benefits. Andre's advocacy extended beyond personal exoneration to comprehensive death penalty abolition. My father's position saved my life, but innocent people without powerful families have been executed. Death penalty must be abolished because no procedural reforms eliminate risk of killing innocent people through systematic racism and prosecutorial misconduct. His principled opposition demonstrated that personal survival-inspired commitment to protecting all capital defendants rather than accepting reforms that preserved fundamentally flawed. Supreme Court issued landmark ruling prohibiting death penalty for defendants under 21. Mitchell case and neuroscience research demonstrate that young defendants lack full culpability, justifying ultimate punishment. Eighth Amendment prohibits executing individuals whose developmental immaturity diminishes moral responsibility. The constitutional precedent-protected category of defendants who had historically faced disproportionate capital punishment. Georgetown law established Mitchell capital defense clinic training future lawyers in wrongful conviction work. Andre Mitchell's experience-inspired commitment to ensuring legal profession includes advocates preventing death penalties, systematic injustices, educational initiatives ensured his suffering would inspire sustained institutional commitment to capital defense and wrongful conviction. Prevention. Dr. Simone Mitchell's perspective acknowledged progress while recognizing ongoing trauma. 7 years later, I still have nightmares about Andre on death row. Our family survived, but death penalty destroys families through wrongful convictions, discriminatory prosecutions, and executions of people who may be innocent. Maternal wisdom emphasized that even successful intervention couldn't eliminate trauma that death penalty created for affected families. Reverend Mitchell's spiritual leadership against capital punishment. Andre's survival is miracle, but faith teaches that government shouldn't execute people, especially through systems so broken it nearly killed my innocent grandson. Death penalty violates sanctity of life that all religions should honor. Religious framework provided moral authority complementing legal and policy. Arguments for abolition as father and son concluded their presentation to sustained applause. The transformation was evident. Wrongful death sentence that nearly destroyed one family had catalyzed national reform movement addressing capital punishment systematic failures. Most importantly, their advocacy emphasized continuing work. Death penalty reform has saved lives, but ultimate justice requires complete abolition. No procedural improvements can eliminate risk of executing innocent people through systematic racism and official misconduct. Andre's message to aspiring lawyers reflected hard-won wisdom. Death penalty is government power at its most absolute and irreversible. Your professional responsibility is ensuring it's never used unjustly, or better yet, ensuring it's never used at all. The standing ovation acknowledged both their courage and the systematic transformation their advocacy had catalyzed. 7 years after wrongful death sentence nearly killed him, Andre Mitchell had transformed from victim to advocate, demonstrating that trauma survivors could inspire change while acknowledging privilege had enabled his exoneration. His future as federal prosecutor would be guided by determination that no defendant would face wrongful capital conviction, that death penalty would be abolished as incompatible with constitutional justice, and that his survival would honor those executed, despite innocence, by demanding systematic transformation, preventing future wrongful executions. The 18-year-old honor student who was wrongfully sentenced to death and the attorney general who demanded comprehensive accountability had together transformed American death penalty practices, proving systematic reform could emerge from individual injustice when positional authority, sustained advocacy, and national conscience converged to demand either death penalty's complete constitutional compliance or its total abolition. Their legacy would be measured not in personal achievement alone, but in the innocent lives saved from execution because one family refused to accept that wrongful capital convictions were inevitable. Tragedies, rather than conquerable injustices, requiring comprehensive federal intervention and sustained institutional transformation, ensuring government never again executed innocent people through systematic racism and prosecutorial misconduct that Andre Mitchell's case had so devastatingly exposed. That journey from wrongful death sentence to exoneration, from individual privilege to systematic reform, from near execution to abolition advocacy, represented the kind of change that made both criminal justice system and entire nation more just, more protective of innocent life, and more faithful to constitutional principles, requiring that ultimate governmental power over life and death serve justice rather than perpetuate racism, unreliability, and irreversible mistakes that capital punishment's history had repeatedly demonstrated. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.